Hello, everybody. So this is the fourth video lecture on the chapter of sexuality and gender in psychology. And in this lecture, I'll probably spend quite more time talking about gender than I will about sex. So just as a little refresher, when we talk about the difference between sex and gender, what we're really talking, sex refers to, well, sex is the biological pieces, right? So it's sort of a description of your body. And then gender, so there's a nice little slide here, and then gender refers to your way of being. It's a cultural, it's a social construction, the ways that people what we think of when we think of as masculine and feminine. Okay, so that's the social, it's more about how you be. And then sexuality is the verb or the process of carrying out your sexual and your reproductive and your sexual energy kind of things. And all of those, well, okay, so I'll just leave it at that. So this slide outlines some social construct concepts like gender role or a gender role stereotype and what we mean by the idea of sexism. So gender roles are like collections of behaviors that we associate with males and females. You know, your typical gender role is that a nurturer and a caregiver, right? Those are traditionally duties that are assigned to women. And then you have like the protector and the provider and the breadwinner. Those are duties that are assigned to men. So it's sort of like the roles, right? And then there's a couple videos that I've linked up about how these gender roles then get used to manipulate or get used in marketing, and how they market certain products to men based on their gender role, based on the role assigned to them as protector, or how these ideas, these collection of behaviors, these roles get marketed to women. Okay, gender role stereotypes are when so this is where it gets difficult because I could like talk a long time about this, but we're in the psychology class. Stereotypes are, they're sort of like cognitive schemas. They're when we summarize, these are ideas in our head where we summarize everything about boys or girls, and we hold on to those ideas and we overgeneralize them. So a stereotype is a collection of ideas that are overgeneralized. So stereotypes would be like all women are good at cooking and all men like sports. And certainly that's not the case, but when we overgeneralize and then we judge women who aren't good at cooking, or when we think less of them, like we think a man who doesn't like sports is less than a man, that's when stereotypes become problematic. Not because we put not because we draw associations, but when they are harmful, when those associations are harmful. And then, sort of to illustrate that point, I've linked up or provided an opportunity for you to watch this classic commercial. Apparently, it was that football. It was a Super Bowl commercial, and it's about when we use phrases like "you run like a girl." What does it mean to be like a girl? And we don't really have like a parallel. So this is an example of when stereotypes become problematic because they imply or they make us or they suggest that to be, in this case, a girl is to be less than, that it's a derogatory thing, right? Sexism, any ism is when we think of one group as less than another group. So racism is when you think of one racial group as less than. Sexism is when you think of, generally, it's assumed that women are less than. But benevolent sexism, benevolent meaning it's harmless or it's good, is a kind of thinking less, in this case of women, as a way of protecting them. So when we think of women as weak, and therefore they must have companionship from a man, that would be considered a benevolent sexism because it is an assumption about a group's weaknesses that is then used to limit them and to limit their movement, right? Um, yeah, so that's the idea of benevolent sexism, some gender terms. Now, in the sociology side, we would not really talk much about observable differences, or any differences that we would see between boys and girls would be explained as learned differences, and that For instance, that the girls are more verbal might be explained because we interact more with our baby girls, and we talk more to baby girls than we talk to boys. And so, of course, they're more verbal because they learn, they're given more opportunity to learn. In the psych chapter, we focus more on these differences with less emphasis on the role of socialization, right? So sociologists are going to acknowledge these differences, but it's going to explain those differences with an emphasis on the social environment. The psych side is going to accept, or be more likely to accept, that these differences are based on some sort of biology or some sort of brain structures, right? So I hope neither side says that there's not brain differences or there's not social learning. They're just going to emphasize, they're going to study more, going to be more yeah, okay. So for instance, some personality differences we see between boys and girls is women tend to be more emotional oriented, more people oriented, more nurturing, and men tend to be less so, more assertive, more thing oriented. Evolutionary psychology, right, says that these patterns of behavior may have originated out on the savannah as a survival strategy, that women's brains, because the relationship between reproduction and women carried around the baby and suckled the baby, that her brain developed in a way to be more in tune to the emotional well-being of her offspring. On the other hand, men's relationship to reproduction was physically removed, and so he's out there on the savannah. He's more likely to be confronted with physical dangers, and so his brain, the parts of his brain that are activated grow stronger and more skilled at not so nurturing things, right? So fast forward millennia, and we see these patterns that remain, these personality patterns, because they get passed down through our genes from one generation to the next. Some thinking differences, some cognitive differences. Women seem to be more verbal. They have more words, right? They learn their words sooner. They use more words. They talk more. Men seem to be more math inclined. And the sociologists observe that this is because we talk more to our girls. We give them toys that are more about talking. We give our boys more spatial things, more building things, right? It could be that our brains are sort of built for this difference, and then we exacerbate them, or we highlight these differences. There's less evidence, and I think this might be a byproduct of a culture that really is trying to move past the sexual double standard. The sexual double standard says that it's acceptable for men to have lots of sexual partners, but not for women to have lots of sexual partners, right? And so, of course, the question is, who's he having sex with if it's not the women anyway? But so the current attitude is that there really aren't a whole lot of differences between boys and girls in terms of sexuality, that the differences that we may have seen historically over women being less promiscuous and women wanting more of a commitment before they would engage in sexuality. So the current thinking is those are old, outdated practices tied to the probability that she's more likely to get pregnant, right? But I think there is a good argument that these differences are grounded in our biology, right? So, for instance, the evolutionary psychologists tell us that one sexual encounter for a woman could potentially translate into pregnancy and at least, 5 years worth of obligation, right? If she gets pregnant, that's 9 months. She has to carry around the offspring on her hip. It suckles her breast. It's completely dependent. That there's a huge burden and a biological burden too on a potential pregnancy resulting from one encounter. Men, on the other hand, don't have this risk. They do not have this risk at all. So for them, the metaphor I remember reading was like, for women, a sexual encounter would be like going out to an expensive restaurant, and they're going to spend hundreds of dollars. And so they're going to read the reviews. They're going to expect a really good meal, right? They're going to be really picky about who they go to bed with. A man, on the other hand, it's more like going to McDonald's, right? He's going to spend $5. If it's good, it's great. If it's not good, he hasn't invested all that much. So he can be He's more casual about it because the risks are much, much, much less greater, right? That's the evolutionary psychology model. Again, is that so valid now that women don't necessarily run the risk of getting pregnant? Now, another potential explanation could be, and of course, I don't know how many people actually know this, is that sexually transmitted diseases, right? A woman is 7 times more likely to contract a sexually transmitted infection from a man, right? So she really is more at risk of getting pregnant, of an infection, than he is. So maybe that translates into some of the differences. In terms, though, of like stepping out of infidelity, women are just about as unfaithful as men. There's actually evolutionary psychology explains that too, that it doesn't make any evolutionary sense for her to have multiple babies with the same man, that about every 4 or 5 years she'll be scouting looking for somebody else. And there's some early evidence that indicates that during what stage in her ovulation she's looking for a different partner. In other words, when she's more likely to conceive, when she's more, more fertile, she's looking for a more masculine, a man based more on physical attraction and strength. But when she's further away from ovulation, when she's looking more for like somebody to commit to help her take care of her children, she actually finds a different kind of man attractive, right? And men's attractions don't necessarily change. They will find certain women more and less attractive at different stages in her ovulation. When she's ovulating, her complexion, her voice, her body smells, those all become more attractive to men. But really, she's the one sort of calling the shots, so to speak. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it in terms of casual sex and all of those things. Okay, I'm going to stop this video right here.